Thanks all for joining. We are building a critical mass of participants here today, and we'll begin in just a moment. Thank you all for joining this important discussion. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead our California Natural Resources Agency. And as part of that job, I have the pleasure of hosting this Secretary Speaker Series, which is an opportunity to lift up big ideas and to bring together transformational leaders from across California to discuss shared priorities. And today we are reflecting on a decade living through navigating an era of megafires, that is, large catastrophic wildfires that are presenting California and our world unprecedented challenges. And we've got a great set of speakers here today to help unpack this topic. Now, we are excited that there are a couple of opportunities for you to both go deeper on things that we're talking about, as well as ask your questions and bring your observations into the conversation. My colleague Geeta Chandra will be staffing the chat function of this discussion. So if you open your chat box, Geeta will populate that with additional information, as well as links, both to our give you more information about our speakers and provide information on topics that we're discussing. There's also a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And at any point during our conversations, if you have a question or an observation, put it into the Q&A, and I and the other panelists will see that, and we'll work to bring your conversation or bring your question into the conversation. So without further ado, I want to bring on the screen CAL FIRE Chief Joe Tyler. You all know that year in and year out, CAL FIRE deploys over 10,000 men and women to protect our communities and our landscapes across California. And Joe Tyler is the director of CAL FIRE. CAL FIRE stands for the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. So while it's about responding to fires, it's also about maintaining healthy landscapes. Joe, welcome.
Thank you.
I first just want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult week for CAL FIRE and our state family. We lost 2 CAL FIRE leaders fighting wildfires this month, as well as a contractor supporting their work. Assistant Chief Josh Bischoff and Captain Tim Rodriguez lost their lives in Southern California fighting fires, as well as pilot Tony Sousa. So I noticed the black band across your shield, and I just want to take an opportunity to express, our collective condolences as the CAL FIRE family mourns these losses.
Thank you.
I'm also cognizant, Joe, that you all are fighting fires across the state as we speak, including some major fires near the Oregon border and one burning in Redwood country. Just wanted to ask you, given it's on the mind of so many here today, just give us a bit of a status report as we spend the rest of the time reflecting on the last 10 years.
No, I appreciate that. So August 14th of this month, lightning really set forward across the central and northern California, leaving hundreds of lightning-caused fires across the North State that actively, between local, state, federal, and tribal partners, they're attempting to mitigate right now. Many of the fires have, in fact, been mitigated, yet we still have some very large and growing larger fires, largely in the Humboldt, Del Norte, Siskiyou, and Trinity County areas. We're working closely with our federal partners to surge resources into those as we contain smaller fires to surge into the larger fires there. As you mentioned, one particular fire that we're actively working on is the Lost Fire in the Redwood National Park. And it appears, based on the leaders on the ground telling me that they have contain the westerly movement of that fire and are assisting our federal partners on containing the rest of that fire in those redwoods.
Well, huge thanks to all that CAL FIRE and its partners are doing. And we're cognizant as we're having this conversation, there are firefighters putting themselves on the line to protect us. So thank you so much for that. So Joe, help us set the frame of this discussion, build everyone's understanding about what's happened over the last decade. You know, you and others have educated me that wildfire is part of our ecological cycle in California. So wildfire is natural, but what seems less than natural is these catastrophic wildfires that we've experienced. And in the flyer promoting this discussion, we reflected on the Rim Fire up in Tuolumne County a decade ago. At the time, I was working for Governor Brown, and it was considered one of the most catastrophic wildfires that we experienced in state history. And then just a decade later, its size and impact slipped to the 11th largest wildfire. So help us understand what's happened over the last decade.
So I appreciate that. And we'll start with what is prompting us to be here today. And as you set the stage, Wade, we really think of the Rim Fire, Stanislaus National Forest, August 17th of 2013, and burned over 257,000 acres. You know, as I've told you, Wade, and told others, when I started my career in the early 90s, firefighters on the ground really talked about what a career fire was to them. And when I say a career fire, it is not meant for enjoyment or fun, but it is what devastating fires were really back in the early 90s. And my career fire, I believed, was going to be the Fountain Fire in 1992 in Shasta County, where fires in that era were anywhere between 60 and 80,000 acres, and those were very large fires at the time. Now, as we progressed forward, we started seeing impacts in the fire environment and the fuels, the topography, and the weather related to that. And there were some fires even more than a decade ago that we really started taking note in, whether it be the 2003 Cedar Fire in San Diego that burned over 273,000 acres, the Zaca Fire in the Santa Barbara coastline in July of 2007 with over 240,000 acres. But then there was a smaller fire that I was on in 2007 as well that really was something that took notice in my experience. And that was on June 24th of 2007, where 3,100 acres burned in the South Lake Tahoe area called the Angora Fire. And that was a big impact of seeing this change even in the Tahoe Basin of large and damaging, even if only 3,100 acres burning at that time. Really, that fire of that size. And where we look at today, you know, we now have the August complex that was in 2020 that burned over 1 million acres. Now, it was several smaller lightning caused fires that burned together to make it part of the August complex, but to have a fire that reached over 1 million acres was significant and really where we should have been catching our attention sooner and more often of that natural occurrence of fire in the landscape that just was not happening, and the forest health conditions were starting to cause larger and more damaging wildfires. Then 2021 hit, and we had two things happen in 2021. We had the Dixie Fire burn across 5 counties in Northern California, Northeast California, burned over 983,000 acres. And we had the Caldor Fire that once again affected the west slope of El Dorado County and into the east slope of El Dorado County. One in July, one in August. But the unique thing about these two fires is where fires would typically stop on the west side of the Sierra Crest, these crested the Sierra Crest and burned onto the east side moving forward. So it is really a realization of these fires that I talk about, as well as the totality of the 11, including the Rim Fire, of where we are in the last decade, that have made us realize that we need to change the way that we are doing business.
Agreed. And we'll get into in a little bit just how we've collectively responded. Governor Newsom, our legislature, investing billions of dollars, not only in your response capacity on wildfire, but our resilience efforts, proactive upfront actions before wildfires ever come. I think one of the things that's really grown out that we can talk about in the last decade is this increased focus, increased investment. So a little bit later in the group discussion, Joe, I want to ask you more about that. But thank you so much for helping us set the frame. I next want to bring onto screen Hugh Safford. Many people know Hugh or Dr. Safford from his time at the U.S. Forest Service, where he was one of its key scientists, helping us understand these evolving conditions over the last decade. And now he serves as a senior scientist at Vibrant Planet, which is an organization, a company that's grown as this wildfire crisis has evolved to bring solutions, community-based solutions to bear. I want to start, Hugh. First of all, welcome. Thanks for joining the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So help us understand from a scientific perspective the role of fire traditionally in California and what's changed over the last decade in recent years.
Yeah, there could be a lot to talk about for a long time, but I think a lot of the audience probably understands a lot of this. And, as I start, one of the things I want to do is I really want to congratulate and laud CAL FIRE for some of the really important changes in thinking that have gone on in that organization over the last 5 or 6 years about the role of fire and how we might begin to work with fire rather than just purely against it. And I know that's difficult stuff to pull off. And I think they're doing a wonderful job, as is the agency, the Forest Service. When I say the agency, sorry, that was my agency. In moving forward this way. I mean, you can list a whole litany of things that went wrong over the course of the last 150 years. I mean, you start with destruction of Native American cultures and populations and time-tested management practices that, they've been using for thousands of years, followed by pretty strict fire exclusion in California for a very long time, originally to protect timber resources. Now it's sort of morphed into protecting human assets and populations. And we've had for a long time a really heavy political and tactical focus on fire suppression and technological fixes. You add these things up, you get fuels buildup, right? And basically what we're doing, Wade, is we're turning forests into chaparral, right? We're connecting forest canopies to the ground, and we're now doing away with the discontinuities that used to exist between trees and between fuel jackpots. And now we're boxed into a corner because the climate is warming, the climate is drying, interannual variability in precipitation is going up. And then we've had millions of people migrate to the high-risk landscapes, most of them with absolutely no notion of the risk. And, for a long time, a lot of those folks were actively engaged in trying to stop agencies like CAL FIRE and the Forest Service from reducing fuels around their properties. Then there's loss of socioeconomic connection, right, to forests and forest condition, which has led to loss of sawmills, loss of bioenergy capacity. There's little to no economic use of forest byproducts. Rural economies have been decimated in California. So, I mean, one of the things that I think we have to understand is our understanding of the general traces of the problem it's not a new thing, right, Wade? I mean, we've known this since the late 60s, early 1970s, that, there's some general, really deep-seated problems in the way that we're managing forests and the way that we were managing fires, particularly in the Western U.S. And there have been a number of failed attempts, and hopefully this last attempt won't be failed, to try to re-engage fire management with resource management in the U.S. But I think what goes on, Wade, is that cognitively people tend, just generally as humans, we tend towards myopia, right? Looking for quick fixes and mistaking symptoms for causes. So the idea, for example, of trying to reduce, burned area in Western forests, it just that on the surface is foolhardy, because you're essentially focusing on a symptom and you're exacerbating the problem, right? By putting easy fires out, we'd increase the potential for fires that we can't stop. We should be focused on ecosystem impacts of fire. And I think we should also be heavily focused on integrated wildfire management and not just focusing on the tools that we can use to stop ignitions when they happen, but how do we prepare landscapes for fire? How do we prepare societies for fire? And how do we recover forests after fire? And all those are not receiving sufficient focus, in my opinion, in the U.S.
Wow, that is a tour de force of explaining how we got in the situation. And so for those that are new to this topic, to me, the takeaways are this is a challenge a century in the making as a result of so-called flat fire exclusion, where we're really chasing all types of fire off the landscape, heavily dense landscapes certainly denser than pre-European contact, which is creating these conditions for catastrophic wildfire, and then climate change with the warming and drying conditions, which is essentially adding challenge onto what we inherited in recent decades. And then your point, Hugh, as I hear it, is, the answer is not to rid landscapes of fire, because again, fire is natural to those landscapes, but to more proactively manage for ecosystem benefits and, of course, community safety.
Yeah, well put.
So given you've spent your career probably trying to sound the alarm on this crisis, how would you characterize where we stand? I mean, what do you think is the state of response and essentially proactive action given your prescription of the challenge?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we can say is, not discrediting, very well-meaning and concerted efforts on the part of a lot of the agencies that manage big parts of our landscapes. The federal response just hadn't solved the problem yet, right? I mean, there's actually a strong positive correlation between the money spent on fire suppression and acres burned. And obviously, that's a pretty simplistic picture of a complex problem. But basically, what it tells you is that more firefighting capacity is not the solution in the end to this. And I'm not trying to say that firefighting capacity is not important, right? But there should be much more money and focus flowing into other facets of integrated wildfire management, like I just brought up: research and analysis, risk reduction, socioeconomic readiness, post-fire recovery. And the other issue you realize is, again, since I know the Forest Service so well, I can speak to them. Federal budgets and agency capacities have always been a big problem. Political cycles are always a huge impediment to forward motion, right? Particularly nationally, I think. And if you look at the Forest Service as an example, it's notably smaller than it was 30 years ago, and only the fire management staff has increased in size. And if you look at Forest Service permanent staffing, 190 million acres or more than that nationally, 156 some odd national forest units. That's half the 28,000 full-time employees. It might sound like a lot, but that's half the number of employees at Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport. So it gives you a feeling for, even if you can throw a lot of money at the problem, there's a real issue with the capacity of agencies to be able to pull it off. And I know that some California agencies are having the same kinds of problems. So one of the other things I think that's important to understand is that, with the direction that burning's gone in the last decade or 2 decades, you've got a pretty attentive audience now, right? I mean, you think about the news recently, Maui, East Coast smothered in smoke. I mean, cities across the U.S. are experiencing hazardous air for weeks now, even though they might be 1,000 miles away from the burning. So, this is the time. This is a good time to try to make some forward motion on this. And I personally think, and this is one of the reasons that after my retirement from the Forest Service, I decided to try a go at the private sector, is that those public-private partnerships that we've been talking about for a long time are going to be key to solving the problem, right? I mean, the funds and the expertise and the new ideas that are available in the private sphere, I mean, they dwarf the capacity of the federal and state governments, right? And I'm not talking about foundations giving money away here. I'm talking about a real partnership where, engagement's not just driven by concern for the problem, but by the profit motive. I mean, that's what's really driven American ingenuity.
I want to unpack that in a little bit of time. And I will say that, while we have so much work ahead of us, I am really heartened that the current administration in Washington, Biden-Harris administration, has made significant investments through legislation, partnerships with Congress, where we in California are now getting more resources through the U.S. Forest Service for these upfront resilience actions than we have in the past.
Yeah.
And I'm also obviously really excited with this quantum leap of investment that we're getting at the state, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Thank you, Hugh. We'll bring you back into the group conversation. I want to next introduce Diana Beasley. Diana serves as Planning and Development Manager for the Tuolumne Band of Miwok Indians. And Diana, welcome, first of all.
Thank you very much.
Help us understand the role of tribal leadership in fire management historically and what was experienced over the last century as essentially a little bit of a framing of where we're moving in terms of tribal state government partnerships.
Sure. So, and Dr. Safford really spoke to, I feel, a lot of the important pieces where in describing the maybe more scientific parts of it about just fire suppression having radically changed the way of life of indigenous peoples in what is now known as California, where people who live on these lands once lived with fire and thrived in fire-driven ecologies. Fire suppression efforts post-colonization really radically changed of course, the way of life of all indigenous peoples, but also just the landscape in general. So, we're seeing radically different forests than ever would have existed, and radically different landscapes in general. And, it's taken some decades to realize this and to see that these megafires thriving once all of these fire suppression efforts kind of spiraled into the landscape we're seeing now, and the catastrophic wildfires that result. Of course, we're in a bit of a mess. There's a lot of work to be done. There's more work than is probably possible financially, physically, all of the ways. But there is hope. We are starting to see a lot of California agencies, especially, but federal agencies as well, involve tribes and reach out and be interested and invested in having tribes have a seat at the table, learning about traditional practices of managing the land, of living with the land, as well as instead of, I think historically when tribes started to become involved, it was more of a, this is what we're going to do, and please, give us tribal feedback. It's starting to be more tribes are involved prior, becoming involved from the ground up, and helping to really shape policy from the beginning stages, which is really, that's going to be critical. If you're developing policy and you're coming to tribes and you're saying, what do you think about this policy we developed without you here? It's very different from having tribes involved at the beginning with and helping to really mold that policy from the beginning. So that's going to be critical, and we're starting to see that happen more and more. The Tuolumne Band of Miwok, we're working with local agencies as well as state agencies and federal agencies to try to ensure that tribal lands are protected, but across the larger landscape as well. So we sit on Yosemite Stanislaus Solutions, which is a incredible regional collaborative that helps to sort of deal with all measures of forestry across the landscape. They are really key in spearheading the Cyril project, which you may know about, which is about 120,000 acres in Tuolumne and Calaveras counties, which is going to be a huge fuel break for those areas. And we're moving into Cyril 2.0, which will actually tie that landscape down into the tribal lands. So we're really excited about that. We're also serving on a steering committee for the Community Wildfire Protection Plan for Tuolumne County, and in turn developing our own tribal community wildfire protection plan specific to tribal lands and driven by cultural practices. So there's a lot of exciting work.
Yeah, so much happening, and I talk about us on really a journey to improve partnerships with tribes and to learn from the tribal wisdom, as you pointed out, that state government, federal government have disconnected themselves from for well over a century. So it's really encouraging these partnerships that are evolving and all the leadership that the tribe that you work for and so many other tribes are providing, with so much more to come. I'll mention, thanks to our legislature, our governor, we actually are very soon essentially establishing or providing funding transfers to tribes specifically for wildfire suppression or resilience cultural burning efforts. In the past, there hasn't been designated funding for tribally led efforts. And thanks to funding and grant transfers we'll be announcing very soon, funding is coming from the state directly into tribally led work. And obviously so much more important work to come on that. So Diana, thank you, and look forward to talking as a group in just a bit. Next, I want to introduce Lacey Hankin. Lacey serves as the fire ecologist for Yosemite National Park. Yosemite, of course, is this world-renowned place that everybody wants to protect. And Lacey, you have an important job, which is helping figure out how to do that in the era of megafire. So if you would talk a little bit about what you're experiencing condition-wise at Yosemite, as it relates to catastrophic wildfire risk, and also importantly, the approach that you and your colleagues are taking within Yosemite to protect that incredibly special place.
Of course, yeah, happy to be here. As Dr. Stafford said, we're experiencing similar issues about the legacy of fire suppression, as well as these prolonged hot droughts. So we're experiencing this greater risk of high severity, similar to the rest of California. And at the National Park Service, our goal is to preserve natural and cultural resources for future generations. And fire has been a part of this landscape for millennia. So fire management is really the primary tool we have to accomplish those goals. We're fortunate to have a long-standing prescribed fire program at Yosemite. It's been in place since about 1970 and has morphed over the years in response to science and changes in best practices and climate change, as well as unexpected events like the rim fire. So the rim fire is still our largest fire in Yosemite history, our largest area of high severity fire, and it definitely increased the urgency and scale of fire and fuels management in the park. So we've expanded our use of prescribed fire, mechanical and manual fuels reduction, and managed wildfire to accomplish community protection as well as ecological goals. And a lot of that work is focused around the wildland-urban interface. We have communities in the park as well. We use mechanical thinning to create defensible space and allow firefighter access. And our other focal area are the giant sequoia groves. So in the past few years, we've lost almost 20% of giant sequoia population around the world. So preventing catastrophic fire in these areas is really critical for their persistence. So we know we need to apply fire at a larger landscape level scale, but there are challenges for actual planning and implementation. A lot of prescribed burns, because of the fuel situation, are basically first entry burns, meaning they largely don't have evidence of having contemporary fire. So this requires a lot of significant mechanical and manual preparation ahead of burning. It's also, we're taking advantage of recent wildfires where we can use those burn footprints as containment lines and really expand our scope of prescribed fire. We've also expanded our use of drones for aerial ignitions, which increases firefighter safety and increases the pace of burning as well when conditions are right. And we've also had a big influx of funding to expand these fuels projects. But the entire planning process requires a lot of staff and a lot of time. So the complexity just necessarily makes things slow, and we have to take advantage of every opportunity we can get. And then I'll mention our kind of last main tool is managed wildfire. And Yosemite is 94% wilderness, so it's kind of our best tool to accomplish these large landscape level fuels reduction treatments. And so we have areas of the park where fire has been allowed to occur for decades, and there are really resilient and healthy forest conditions in this area. But in other areas like the rim footprint, things are changing. So we can't necessarily rely on those areas as barriers to fire spread. We're also seeing type conversion to shrubs, which change fire behavior, as well as these big snag patches, which are an immense hazard to firefighters. So these are all considerations that we have to take into account now as we're having these changes in forested landscapes and changes in conditions that increase some of the consequences and expected fire behavior across the landscape. But we do, we incorporate a lot of science and monitoring into our fuels efforts. So this allows us to make sure we have all of the most up-to-date information, all of the best science at our disposal as we prioritize limited resources and actions.
Wow, Lacey, this is really encouraging. And as if I'm recalling correctly, that those prescribed burns around some of the sequoia groves were actually really helpful over the last couple of years in protecting those sequoia groves from fire. Is that right? Absolutely. In the Washburn fire last year, which occurred right outside of the Mariposa Grove, areas where we have implemented 40, 50 years of prescribed fire, as well as the mechanical thinning, were areas
where we were able to actually put firefighters to go direct, and fire behavior changed. It came down to the surface and allowed a lot of successful firefighting efforts. So those areas are really critical access points for suppression efforts.
Thanks so much. And then what does success look like in Yosemite in 10, 20, 30 years if your efforts, do what they're intended to do?
Sure. I think on the fuels management side, ideally we'd like to be in the maintenance phase of prescribed burning. So no longer first entry conditions, and we're just, making sure that we're maintaining those burn effects. And in terms of managed wildfire, being able to expand the areas where we can comfortably manage those unplanned ignitions.
Got it. Dr. Hankins, thanks so much. We're going to get back to you in our conversation. Our last speaker is a colleague of mine in state government, and that is Elliot Vanderkolk. Elliot works at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, which is one of our 10 state conservancies, and his job is Senior Forest and Climate Advisor. Welcome to the discussion, Elliot.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So as I understand it, when we were catching up before this discussion, you explained that you have spent 7 years on the rim fire, and specifically post-rim fire restoration. So much of what we've talked about in the discussion so far is what do we need to do to avoid fires from becoming huge and catastrophic and really decimating the landscapes and communities. But we have yet to talk about what happens when one of these fires comes through, like the rim fire. So if you would talk about this effort over the last 7 years and where it stands now as it relates to the rim fire.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I was first brought on, as Secretary Covert mentioned, in 2016 to help spearhead an effort that was led by the previous administration, where we brought together many state agencies, the Office of Planning and Research, Cal EPA, Department of Housing and Community Development, CAL FIRE, the California Conservation Corps, and ourselves. And really, we partnered with Tuolumne County and the U.S. Forest Service to think critically about what are ways that we can respond to the rim fire, not only to recover that forest in the conditions that Lacey just talked about a bit, those high severity fire patches in particular, but also looking forward in a resilient framework to the next fire. And the state was successful in receiving a $70 million award from the Department of Housing and Urban Development for a special project that really integrates both forest and community resilience to that. So on the one hand, we're looking back at the forest to see where are areas where we think that the fuels were still too high, where we think that not everything was cleared out by these forests over time, but they need to be treated, as well as having trouble moving forward to avoid that type conversion that Lacey just mentioned, to go back in and replant diverse native conifers to steward that forest moving forward, but also looking critically at what the community protection needs still are, like expanding fuel breaks to look forward to that next fire. Tuolumne County was also integral in this project in creating 2 new community resilience centers that are going to offer year-round services to folks in Tuolumne County, but also to serve as temporary evacuation shelters. And the third is really looking forward to the third part of this integrated project is really looking forward to that future need and maintenance, and even in first entries, of finding a place for that low to no value material that we're removing a lot of these restoration projects to go. So we've just this summer closed on 2 loans in partnership with other funders to develop 2 new businesses that we're really excited are going to help chip away at this problem moving forward. And I think what's really key to this project is that it's an integrated one. And it's really thinking about these problems are interrelated. And for so long, we've spent time thinking about and having to triage between this green forest, proactive forest management, as we've been talking about, and also reactive, going back to these places that we think won't recover on their own and having those interventions. And this project is helping us to think about models where we look at the whole landscape to move that whole area forward, knowing that resilience is going to look different on every acre within those burn footprints.
Elliot, really helpful and encouraging, and I think a model for other catastrophic wildfires and recovery efforts for those specific fires. Can you talk a little bit about the approach that the Sierra Nevada Conservancy is taking to try to build more of this holistic landscape level resilience to wildfire? I'm really proud of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and our other state conservancies, which are all locally focused or regionally focused, regionally based, and I think you all at Sierra Nevada have really developed a model around how to assess the needs across a region and then move at the scale needed given this crisis. Can you share a little bit more on that?
Yeah, certainly. So there's going to be three main points I'm going to make here. One is, as you mentioned, we really do need to start working at the landscape scale. And then to do so, we really need to start and focus our work on developing the partnerships and the collaboratives and that capacity of groups to do that work. And then the third is really we need to be committed to those areas for the long haul. So working at the landscape is something that we've been struggling with for a long time. I think for so long we've been funding individual projects, which there will always be a need to do small, high priority projects, especially in and around communities. But if we really want to tackle this crisis, we're going to have to meet it at the scale which is happening, which is really starting to work at that 10 to hundreds of thousands of acre scale. So last year, as Secretary Crowfoot just mentioned, we developed our landscape investment strategy, which really maps out how we use our programs and try to develop new ones to solve this problem. And fundamental to that really is this focus on partnerships and collaboratives within our region. So we've come up with this concept of landscape grant readiness. So it's really looking across our region at partnerships that are have the nuts and bolts and the best practices that are needed to, one, bring together a diverse group of partners, from tribes to stakeholders, but also to start looking at the landscape itself to understand, as I mentioned earlier, what does resilience look like in every piece of this landscape? And then making sure that those groups have the capacity to do this, both the staffing capacity, but also the organizational capacity to bring in large sums of money and deploy them effectively. So we've been working in partnership with the Department of Conservation to try to support these groups directly to grow their capacity. And we're really excited to move this forward, especially, and we can talk about this later, about how we're working with tribes in that program. And then lastly, really, we need to be thinking about committing to the long haul. As I mentioned, in the rimfire, we're 10 years out. We still are doing projects in that area. This is a long-term process of both recovery, and it's going to take a long-term time for us to move forward. So while we know that there's been unprecedented and even exponential increase in both state and federal resources to this, we know that the demand is also, and the costs have both increased dramatically over that decade. So we need to be able to keep pace with that. Just as an example, our current wildfire recovery and forest resilience grant program has received over $95 million in requests for only $35 million available. So we've seen this trend of 2 to 3 times request for the resources that we have available to us. And so we need to continue that momentum to make sure that we have dedicated resources to do that, both those first entries that Lacey talked about, but also those maintenance activities over time.
Yeah, it's so helpful to understand that. And I'll share that our approach in the Newsom administration is not that we're dictating projects from Sacramento. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution across our state. And the answers are certainly not found in Sacramento or Washington, D.C. But Elliot, as you talk about, really empowering the regional players, the local players that actually know these landscapes the best to develop capacity so they can work together, identify prioritized projects, and then state and federal government, fund that pipeline of projects. For those that aren't aware, the state, the Newsom administration has our Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, which is really meant to be very specific and transparent about where the state government is figuring into these solutions. We also have a task force with the same name, the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. And if you're not clued into the work of the task force, I would argue, and you're interested in this, I would argue that you should be. This task force meets on a quarterly basis. Those meetings are public. We're going to different portions of the state. Next in-person meeting or hybrid meeting is in Reading up north. And the focus is really how to empower local leaders, regional leaders, tribal governments, conservation partners to actually lead, to identify the work, and then for state government and our federal partners to make it easier to fund those projects. So a lot of progress made with a lot of work ahead. Thanks so much, Elliot. I want to bring the group together and bring us all on screen for a discussion. And again, if you have questions or observations, please put them in the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. I'll mention that we're also recording this discussion. So if you want to come back and listen to comments that our panelists are making, or you want to share this discussion will be up on our website at resources.ca.gov in just the next couple of days. My first question is for you, Joe. most Californians know CAL FIRE as the wildland firefighters who are out there battling these fires. I think less of our state residents know about the role that CAL FIRE plays in forestry and upfront resilience. Can you talk a little bit about where forest landscape resilience figures in amidst all of CAL FIRE's priorities?
Wade, thank you for that. The Department of Forestry and Fire Protection went through a rebranding some time ago. And with that, through tight budget times and budget reductions, some hard decisions had to be made in prior administrations about the reduction of natural resource protections and resource management staff. And I will hand it to the administration moving forward now. And unfortunately, the damaging and catastrophic fires that we've seen, we continue to see investments in forest health and resilience efforts. There is a good portion of this department, as people will note, is by civil service classifications, what sounds like or what is a firefighting classification. But we've been very clear to all of our personnel that when they are not fighting emergencies, I expect them to be doing forest health and fuels reduction across the state of California. We are a dual purpose organization. I have actually thought about bringing it back to the forefront of using the name, the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, more so than CAL FIRE, to bring back the history of this department and where we need to be able to move forward. Now, under a whole resource protection program, we have various aspects: climate and energy. We have forest practice enforcement. We have research and monitoring. And all of these programs are not only located here in Sacramento, but they're decentralized across 21 administrative units in 2 regions across the state. And it is those people that are on the ground that are working with their local, federal, and tribal partners, as well as our private partners, to really look at the landscapes and the landscape level treatments that need to be occurring. A comment was made earlier about interconnecting and cross-boundary treatments that are necessary. And that is one of the challenges that we recognize, and I think Elliot might have brought it up earlier as well. And that is, there is a lot of funding coming forward, over $2.7 billion of this administration for forest health and resilience, as well as the bill and IRA funding, bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act funding coming forward. And there is a lot of funding, but where we land is trying to get that funding out the door to be able to administer and operationalize this. And the only way we're going to do this is by doing it together. And that is how sometimes we have found that maybe the projects didn't interconnect. Maybe the projects were not cross-boundary for the overall good of putting funding in the places that it needed to go. And I think that there are some initiatives coming forward through the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, as well as some treatment trackers and viewers that will be coming forward here very shortly, that are really going to show how and where we need to be interconnecting these projects, both for first treatments and ongoing.
Absolutely. This can't be random acts of wildfire resilience. We have to prioritize and connect. One of our audience members, John, shared 2 observations. One is we need to provide grants at the level that allows for landscape work. So it's not hundreds of acres, it's probably thousands, 10,000s, even hundreds of thousands of acres, as Elliot said. And then 2, we have inherited an alphabet soup of government programs for funding these projects. And we have to figure out how to align them, streamline them, make it easier for our local and regional partners to utilize different forms of funding, including some federal funding and some state funding. Hugh, I'm interested in your perspective. Part of our challenge historically has been this phenomenon of so-called fire borrowing, where it seemed like the U.S. Forest Service budget for resilience work always got chipped away during wildfire season to fight fires. And my understanding is there was some congressional reform that is protecting that resilience funding more, and combined with the Biden-Harris investments in resilience are bringing several $100 million of new funding into the state. Can you just talk about that and the impact you think that may have?
Yeah, sure. With the understanding that I don't work for the agency anymore, so I can't speak for them as a political entity, but I can say that, yeah, that was a well-known problem, and it bit us in the butt so many years. And it doesn't really, going forward, it shouldn't do that so much anymore. I mean, fires are being treated more like the emergencies they are, I think. And so there's money set aside in the beginning off the top of the budget. And that's important. Yeah, I mean, I think, name the agency that doesn't have issues with how to staff the right way and responding quickly. I mean, it's tough to move a lot of people and a lot of political inertia, even when there are big changes in political leadership. And sometimes that's good, but it can be difficult to respond quickly. And, for me, I think maybe the biggest issues are, okay, there's the strategic side and just for disclosure's sake, one of the reasons I ended up at Vibrant Planet is because they've been working very heavily at sort of at that level. How do you help people understand where you link money coming in from the top to what needs to actually be done on the ground to affect real change? And I think that's kind of where the genius of the organization is. But that said, getting money to the ground is a big deal, and it's very difficult to pull off. Wade, I'm sure in your agency, it's the same as it is in the Forest Service in CAL FIRE. But man, when you flood anybody with money, they're going to have a lot of trouble getting it out the same number of spigots they had to get out 1/10 of that money the year before. And so I think, the contracting staffs, grants and agreements type staffs, that sort of stuff. And it's been hard to keep people on as well because they're all overworked. And I don't blame anyone for complaining in that line of work anyway. The UC system is having the same issue. So, I mean, you know how it is. You just run up against, you hit one barrier, you get around it, you realize, oh, there's another one, and you get around that and there's another one, and you just can't stop. And that's what makes success in the world, right? Are those people and those organizations that they've got this star that they're going for and they're going to get there independent of what gets in the way. And I think that's got to be it. And if we can maintain the initiative that that you've had, that the Newsom administration has had, that we can had with Governor Brown before too, and you can continue this longer term, real change will happen. Yeah, at least that's my opinion.
Yeah. And Alex, another person participating in the discussion, asks, is there potential for our agency or others to provide continual revolving funding for landscape level resilience initiatives? And that's really what we're focused towards. From my perspective, we have to move fast, but we also have to think long. And as we've talked about today, this has to be continual. This can't be an on again, off again. And it's certainly not a case of you spend a bunch of money and it's mission accomplished. Moving forward, we have to continue to invest in landscape level management, ecologically based management. So, Alex, I'm not sure that whether it's necessarily, legally continual revolving, but we're working to create consistent funding over time. And then to your point, Hugh, help our local solution providers actually, get funding from the federal and state government fairly efficiently, and then being able to deploy the funding to actually get the work done. Diana, we're getting a lot of comments on just the comments on the critical importance of tribal leadership. And one question I want to ask you is, we probably have a lot of people involved in this work, some who are already working with tribes. For those who are not working with tribes in their area or want to learn more about what tribes are doing, what is your recommendation for beginning to build those relationships and those partnerships?
Yeah, I think, I'd say more and more as years go by, we have more and more agencies, NGOs, et cetera, reaching out. And my advice would be to, if you are interested in working with tribes or partnering with tribes in your region, go to the tribes and see what work they have prioritized now, and then see how you can participate in that work. I find a lot of people come to the tribe and they say, we really want to do this project. Like, how do you guys want to be involved? We are so maxed out. I don't know of a tribal government where everybody doesn't wear 10 hats have we have to prioritize the will of the tribe. And so we're, as much as we'd love to partner and work on projects outside of tribal lands and outside of tribal priorities, we have a lot going on. And so my advice would be to come to a tribe and say, what is your focus? What do you want to see done on your lands? And how can we maybe collaborate and participate to achieve our goals as a result, instead of more coming with, we have this project and what can you guys do to support us? As much as we'd love to join in and support every project in our region, it's just not entirely feasible. So, you know, and if you did want tribal participation in that project, maybe it's coming to a tribe and saying, you know, we'd love your participation in the project. How can we facilitate that happening? Maybe it's adding somebody to your tribal government that can be a liaison between these two projects, you know, adding to your staffing, just supporting your ongoing, you know, administrative costs, those kind of things, and not making it a burden to the tribe to participate in projects that might not be directly benefiting tribal lands. As you know, again, we love to be collaborators in the greater region, but we have to focus on tribal lands and the tribal community first. And it's just not always possible to overextend ourselves and help out with every regional project that may want to go on.
I think those are really helpful points. And something I've learned is that, you know, all of us who aren't working in tribes or directly with tribes need to take time to educate ourselves on what's already happening, to your point, and identifying how we can support those tribally led projects that are already existing, because those are priorities for the various tribes across the state. So very helpful, Diana. Some questions coming in about technology and the use of technology moving forward. A bunch of different applications and investments are being made. Maybe starting with you, Lacey or Elliot, on the role of technology in the work that you all are doing, either in planning treatments or monitoring treatments, or even planning sort of the larger level landscape work.
Sure, I can start. I'll be quick, Elliot. Yeah, our main kind of advances in technology is our expanded use of drones, as I mentioned, for actual burn implementation and patrol following the burn, so we can reduce the number of staff required to stay on each burn. And then our use of terrestrial and airborne LiDAR in planning as well as monitoring. So these laser technologies allow us to quantify fuels in a 3D image across the park and really capture forest structure from the ground up and the complexity in there. So that allows us to prioritize different areas as well as look at change over time as treatments are implemented.
Helpful. Elliot?
I think across our region, it really runs the gamut. Some folks are highly sophisticated using things like land tender, like from Vibrant Planet, to others that really just know their ground and know what needs to be done. And we just had a pilot program that I ran at our agency that's really focused on aligning funding sources, as we mentioned, but also trying to use some of the latest data in our decision making. And really, what it came down to is we dove into some of that data is really confirming that people in our region are doing projects where it matters, for wildlife habitat, for carbon sequestration, for risk to communities. There's a confirmation that's happening that I'm seeing across the data, that these groups that really know their ground well are doing projects in the right place, which is really heartening, because it means that there's a lot of different approaches, and groups can approach this kind of as they see fit.
Definitely. So there continues to be among some folks in California real concern and skepticism that forest management is not necessarily ecologically based or doesn't benefit the nature and the biodiversity. And I want to ask the two scientists that we have on our panel, Dr. Safford and Dr. Hankin, how do you consider this work, and how do we ensure that actually this is doing right by the landscape and all the animals and the biodiversity of life that depend on the landscapes? How do we avoid a situation where we might be controlling for catastrophic wildfire risk, but having a negative impact on the biodiversity of our lands?
I can start. Lacey, you might want to chime in on this. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to understand the reality of the situation, which is that outside of private lands owned by a couple of large timber organizations, institutions in California, there's almost not a timber industry in California anymore. The number of sawmills has just about gone down to zero in terms of what's available for the agencies to use. I mean, I've seen people making comments about potential projects in Southern California and calling them commercial timber. What? The nearest mill to that is hundreds of miles away, and it's not going anywhere. I mean, that's taxpayer money being spent in order to reduce fire risk. Now, there's no question but that in terms of the level of what's the right word? The right level of engagement between agencies and between the public, it needs to be augmented notably. And this comes down to having very few people having to do a lot of work on a huge landscape. I noted, for example, how short-staffed the Forest Service is in general. And the agency, I think, recognizes that it needs to do a better job of having those sorts of dialogues. But what I would say is that it's a little trite, but people are not seeing the forest for the trees. That's what it comes down to. We're talking about ecosystems here, not this tree and that tree. And if anyone knows anything about historical conditions in these systems managed by lightning and by Native Americans for millennia, they look nothing like what forests look like today. John Muir would not recognize the forests that we're trying to manage. They are highly risky places to be. They're at very high risk of loss at very, very large scale. I mean, we're going to be looking like northern Baja California soon if we don't do something about it. And understanding that the legacy of long-term, probably heavier than it needed to be, a logging in a lot of the Western U.S. continues to be a nightmare for people. But I can tell you that at this moment in time, almost every log that comes off of Region 5 property, not all of it, but almost all of it, is fuel reduction. And this term commercial logging, it's a euphemism for something I don't really understand. I mean, everything that gets done in the U.S. gets done by money. If there isn't money available, things don't happen. Everything that we do in our lives has a commercial aspect to it. So I think that doesn't mean anything.
Thanks, Hugh. Lacey, obviously Yosemite, one of the most treasured places in the world, if not the country. How do you ensure that the work you're doing does right by the biodiversity and what we know as the nature of Yosemite?
Sure. So we are, we do have a bit of a different forest history in some areas of the park. There hasn't been much commercial logging, but there has been logging in areas of the park throughout history. But the main way that we ensure that we're meeting, ecosystem health and ecological objectives is through partnerships with academic institutions to do research, through internal research, and through long-term monitoring programs. So we've had wildlife and fire effects and hydrologic monitoring going on in the park for 50 years now. So we've been able to look at those long-term impacts of treatments. And then we are fortunate to be of interest to a lot of different researchers. So we've had an abundance of research in the park that's shown, the impacts of natural wildfires, the impacts of some of our prescribed fire and fuels reduction treatments, as well as high resolution, collar data on some of our endangered species. So using all of that information, we've been able to piece together kind of what the ideal kind of forest condition is for the most resources at a time. And typically that is those heterogeneous forest structures that are naturally caused by wildfire, at least wildfire in the natural range of variation.
Yeah, thanks for that. So this is a fascinating and complex topic, and we could spend hours talking about it, but our hour together is essentially up. So I want to thank our panelists for being here. I want to also thank the several hundred people who joined. I want to share that not only is there more funding focused on forest resilience and landscape health than there ever has been, I think there's more opportunities to interface with government on this. And again, I would invite people to join the listserv of our Wildfire and Landscape Resilience Task Force if you want to keep up to speed and want to participate in those public dialogues, or take part in these regional collaboratives that are being funded through our Department of Conservation called the Regional Forest and Fire Collaboratives. So much work to get done. I have to say, this has been such a challenging decade to work on these issues. But also, as somebody who works, day in, day out this, I'm more encouraged than ever as I see everything that we're doing together in California. And I will say, as Canada and Greece and Hawaii suffer catastrophic wildfire this summer, I'm really heartened that we're working with those jurisdictions to share what we know about the crisis and what we're doing about it, as well as learn from others. So we will continue to make progress, protect California, both our human communities and our natural communities, thanks to the work of all of you here today. James, if you would put the slide up, finally, If you have follow-up questions or suggestions for us, either on this topic or other topics we should address on the speaker series, please let us know. And once again, if you want to access a recording of this discussion, one will be available at resources.ca.gov in the next few days. Panelists, once again, thank you. And for all who joined, thank you very much.